This is a Tab Media special report on archaeology and its impact on how we read and interpret the Bible. I'm your host, Jennifer Rash, and joining me is co-host Margaret Colson and New Testament professor Dr. James Strange of Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Strange, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
We were drawn to the topic of biblical archaeology following the December news report of the discovery of an ancient synagogue near the Sea of Galilee. This particular find highlights the debate over Mary Magdalene's birthplace. And with Dr. Strange's expertise in the area of archaeology, particularly that of ancient Galilee, we knew he was the perfect guest to share about the topic. But before we talk about the Mary Magdalene debate, tell us about your experience and work in archaeology, Dr. Strange.
Well, it's a longer story than I have time to tell. I grew up with a father who was an archaeologist. He started digging when I was, I guess, in the first grade. And I remember the first summer that he went to Israel, talking to him on the phone and hearing a delay over the phone line. I think I got to talk to him one time. He left clean shaven, came back with a beard. That was back in 1969, and he dug for the rest of his academic career. He spent over 40 years digging and taking students to dig in Israel. And when I was trying to discern what it was that I was going to do with my life, that was the thing that fit the best and fit strongest. So I ended up pursuing a similar career. So I've been digging with students in the Galilee since 2009. I first started taking Samford students to a large city excavation in Galilee, not too far from Nazareth. As a matter of fact, we live in Nazareth when we dig. And then switched to another small town that we excavate now. We've been excavating since 2012. And I take, as I said, Samford students, but also students from other institutions and plenty of non-students. So if you're listening to this or watching it, and you think you might want to dig in Israel, please contact me. No prior experience is required. And we regularly
Margaret, do you hear that?
Yeah. I very rarely have somebody who regrets that they came to dig in Israel. Wow. So I've been spending my time digging at a site that's, very close to Nazareth. It was a small Jewish village similar to Nazareth during the lifetime of Jesus, really before, during, and after the lifetime of Jesus. Unlike Nazareth, it did not survive into the present. Nazareth is now the largest city in northern Israel. Our little village was abandoned sometime in the 4th century, right around the time that Christianity was assuming ascendancy in the area. We don't know why yet. There are a couple of different candidates. There's an earthquake and there's an invasion. But in any case, we've been digging this little village that we have known about for a long time. It's been identified and known about, but nobody had excavated yet. So we started digging, as I said, in 2012, and right away found a synagogue similar to the ones that are found at Magdala, which we can talk about a little bit later on. And then we found a pottery industry. Now, we knew that we were pretty sure that was going to be there, but it was really stimulating to find this industry of potters who were distributing their wares all over the region, and a few other things that were lovely surprises as well. So that's where we've been digging for the past several years, except for the past 2. We had to cancel due to COVID, of course, but we are hoping to dig in 2022.
That's wonderful. And I do find archaeology fascinating, although I've never been on a dig. I would love to go on one.
Well, I know one you might be interested in.
And you're actually directing the site, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
From your perspective and experience, in what ways can archaeology contribute to a greater understanding of and appreciation for the Bible and our faith?
That's a great question. The way that it really contributes the most, I think, is to remind us that we're talking about real human beings when we talk about Bible stories. Quite often Jesus is talking in parables, so that doesn't necessarily mean that he's talking about an event, but the kinds of things that he talks about in those parables, the agricultural practices, or even a statement as straightforward as people don't put lamps under bushel baskets or under beds, but on lampstands. That opens us, archaeology helps us see those references in light of what we know about ancient technology and how much light a lamp gives off and how putting it on a lampstand increases the lumens that it produces inside. We think about what average light is like inside of a house in the ancient world compared to now. How when the sun goes down, you can extend your awake time a little bit with artificial light, but not like you can today. We think about how it's largely an agricultural economy, which again shows up in Jesus's parables. All of archaeology really, people use the language brings alive stories of the Bible, and I think that's a pretty good way of talking about it. We don't have to imagine that we're talking about something fantastical. No, we're talking about the lives of real human beings. And it also reminds us that when we enter the Bible, we really are entering another world. I remind my students all the time that our biblical forebears, of course, did not speak our language. They also had different skin tone than we do. They practiced a different religion than we did. They were Jewish. They didn't have the same sense of personal and intimate space that you and I have. They ate, of course, different foods. They smelled differently. I think when I tell my students, if you could go back in time and get out of your time machine, the first thing that might assault your nose was the smell of your fellow human beings. While at the same time, they might be saying, why doesn't that person smell like anything? What's wrong with them? I can't smell them. In one way, archaeology helps us remember the distance that separates us from our forebears. And at the same time, it reminds us, no, they're real human beings and they face life's contingencies in much the same way that we do. So that's, I guess that's a short way of talking about what archaeology can help us do. Typically, as an archaeologist, when I'm using the New Testament, what I do is I use it to help me form hypotheses to test by digging. So we can talk about that with Magdala in a little bit if you like. But what should we expect to find if we're excavating? Say, if we're looking at, how would we know that we found a synagogue? Mm-hmm. And if we decide that it is a synagogue, what should we expect to find within it when we dig? Do the texts of the New Testament help us in any way?
Well, go ahead and jump there with this find in Magdala. What would be the answer to that question?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit of the story. So for a long time, especially after a very influential scholar named Howard Clark Key, back in the 1990s, wrote about it, people decided that in the New Testament, when the text said that Jesus went into a synagogue or entered a synagogue, that it was not a reference to a building. The word simply means assembly. And now, by extension, it means place of assembly. Something happens similar with the word prayer. The word prayer can mean place of prayer. That happens in the book of Acts when Paul and his entourage go to Philippi. The text actually says where they knew there was a prayer. Well, we know to interpret that as place for prayer or synagogue. So it means assembly. The word synagogue means assembly. So we're not talking about a building. We're talking about any place where the assembly has gathered. Mm-hmm. Well, that hypothesis or that claim started encountering problems when people started finding synagogues in Judea around Jerusalem, dating back to the first century, Jesus's day. Mm-hmm. Of course, the immediate rejoinder was, well, we haven't found any in the north where Jesus was from. Then we started finding them in the north. But of course, not immediately in Galilee, in the region right next to Galilee, called Galanitis, or the Golan Heights today. One was found in a town called Gamla. But then the archaeologists at Capernaum, which was Jesus's home, his new hometown after Nazareth. He made it his headquarters in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One, or remains of the archaeologists claimed were the remains of a synagogue were found there. The thing about Magdala was in 2009, the first synagogue was found. Now that's a revolutionary statement. I said first synagogue. So first of all, people said, we found the synagogue at Magdala. And then some people said, well, maybe there was another one. And
Okay.
it was a fantastic discovery for lots of reasons.
Mhm.
But just this year, a second first century synagogue was found. So now we have a small city that we know about from ancient sources, close to Tiberias, a big city,
Okay.
that during the time of Jesus had at least two synagogues and maybe more. And so we're just beginning to think that probably if we continue to dig in all the right places, if we dig a first century Jewish village, if we kept at it, we would eventually find the synagogue of that village. We think probably every synagogue had a village. Now that has to remain hypothetical until we start finding them. But Magdala really kind of shook us all. We were just surprised out of our skulls. As a matter of fact, I did a webinar in November, and I knew that the second synagogue had been found, but the news had not been released. And I was asked by some archaeologists, please don't tell. They actually showed me some photos of it. So the whole time that I was talking about the Magdala synagogue, I couldn't talk about the other one.
So
The
you
other
were
one has now
holding
been
on to
found.
this news all this time.
That's right. And I didn't find either one of them. They were both found accidentally, by the way, by construction, which happens a lot in Israel. You
Really?
can hardly dig in Israel without finding ancient remains. And so regularly, with the expansion of roads or the building or digging of new foundations for new buildings, ancient remains are found. And that's how those two were found.
Well, let me ask a question. I know I've read that some scholars, when these two synagogues have been found in Magdala, point to Mary Magdalene and say this must be where she hailed from, Mary of Magdala. But then there are other scholars who say not so fast. Magdalene might have different meanings. How do you look at those interpretations and come up with what you're comfortable with in terms of what is found in these digs?
Well, it's an important question. On one hand, there's a linguistic argument, which has nothing to do with archaeology, and that is, what does Magdalene mean? And for a long time, scholars have been interpreting this ending, this "in" ending, like they interpret the one on the end of Jesus the Nazarene. So that apparently refers to the place where Jesus was, according to the Gospels, where he was living. Both Matthew and Luke place him being born in Bethlehem. But even John calls him from Nazareth. So Jesus the Nazarene, well, if we have another Mary Magdalene, that sounds like the place that she's from or the place where she is born. The linguistic argument says, well, it can mean, because the word Migdal in Aramaic, I'm sorry, in Hebrew means tower. Magdala in Aramaic means the tower. They're saying this could be a way of referring to her stature, say within early Christianity. Well, certainly that's possible. But we have at least one other instance in the New Testament of referring to somebody by a place name. So that's where that idea comes from. Now, the finding of a synagogue there doesn't really help us make that argument one way or the other. What's interesting about Magdala is how it was identified and then how people started digging there. One of the things that archaeologists do when they want to dig at a site known from the Bible is to say, well, how do we know that we're digging this site? And sometimes it's easy. Well, Nazareth, well, that's maintained the same name for centuries. Jerusalem, it's been there for centuries, been occupied for centuries. Sometime a town is abandoned, but the ruin maintains the ancient name. That happens a few times. What we had on the shore of the Sea of Galilee was an Arab village called El Mejdel, and you can hear Migdal surviving in that Arabic word. It survived. That village was there up until 1948. When archaeologists or scholars look in the Gospels, they notice a couple of things. Number one, Magdala is never mentioned, except as the appendage to the name of this woman named Miriam, a very common name. It's the name, of course, of Jesus' own mother. So then they start looking at well, I'm sorry, it's mentioned in a couple of ancient copies of Matthew. They start looking at ancient people who are talking about the region, and they find out that some very well-known Christians who lived in the area starting in the 4th century and to the 5th didn't know about a town named Magdala. They never mention it. When we start getting Christian pilgrims going to the Holy Land, at least writing it down about their pilgrimage starting in the 4th century, they also don't mention a Magdala. It doesn't mean they didn't went there, but they didn't go there. But it's kind of odd not to be seeing this, especially when they end up around the Sea of Galilee, and they don't mention anything about it. When they finally start mentioning it, not until the 6th century, it doesn't seem to be terribly impressing them very much. They don't talk about the village. They just mentioned that there's a church there. They mentioned Mary was from there. We don't know where they're getting their information. What we have in Greek text is the reference to a town with an entirely different name called Tarikia, which means something like place of salted fish. And we get a 5th century reference in the Talmud about a place called the Tower of Fish, Migdal Nunya. And because both sets of, this is getting kind of long, I know, both sets of sources place it in about the same place in reference to Tiberias, we begin to form the hypothesis, okay, we think these are both referring to the same town. Due to these later Christian references, we don't know how early they start, but we think we can piece together a hypothesis telling us that on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, there was a town called Magdala, Migdal Nunya, Tower of the Fish. There are other towers, Tower of the Valley, and towers of this, that, and the other around. And if we begin to excavate there, based on what these texts tell us, we will discover evidence of a Jewish population before the time of Jesus, during the time of Jesus. And eventually, when Christianity starts to take hold, evidence of a Christian population, a church, maybe a monastery, something like that. And sure enough, those things have turned up in the archaeological record. Still, our identification of the site has to be provisional, since nobody dug up a street sign that said, "Welcome to lovely downtown Magdala," care of the JCs or something like that. So that's how we proceed as archaeologists. The most important thing for our New Testament reference, of course, is the fact that we have 2 synagogues here. So that when the Gospels tell us that Jesus is traveling around the region teaching and healing in synagogues, it's not simply referring to assemblies. It could, in some instances, of course, refer to that. But it is probably, in most instances, we think now, referring to actual dedicated buildings built for the purpose of synagogue practices. One of which is reading, which Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke, healing, which he does an awful lot in various texts, and we think other things as well, prayer, things like that.
So it's almost like putting pieces together of a puzzle, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah, it really is. And and as I said before, at every point we have to be conservative in what we're willing to say, and sometimes even pose it as a further hypothesis. Well, we think if we keep digging, this is what we're going to find.
When different things are discovered or found, the headlines will be out there. There's usually an announcement or a news report.
Right.
Pretty much anytime something significant is uncovered. But I did notice the headline for this one. One of the headlines read, "Second Temple Period Synagogue Found Where Gospel's Mary Magdalene Was Born." What was the tie? Why highlight a person this time versus many times it just says X, Y, and Z has been uncovered? What do you think was happening there?
Well, sometimes I'm trying not to be terribly cynical about this, but sometimes it does help sell copy, to mention a famous person's name.
Okay.
But on the other hand, we're not just inventing that connection with Mary Magdalene. You should know that the very first synagogue was found when a branch of the Catholic Church that had purchased that land, there was already a branch that owned land of Magdala. It was the Franciscans,
Mhm.
and they dug back in the 1960s, found a big chunk of the city. But another group called the Legionaries of Christ, which own property in Jerusalem and
Mhm.
have a pilgrimage center there, said we would like a pilgrimage center on the Sea of Galilee.
Mhm.
We would like it to highlight women in the church and their importance in the history of the church.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so when they were digging actually to lay the foundations for their hostel, it was the backhoe that dug up that big stone that you see in the photograph that was published in the Alabama Baptist.
Mhm.
And that, by the way, was a just a striking find. Nothing like that had ever been found before. In a synagogue, a stone depicting the menorah in the temple of Jerusalem, and we think other implements of the temple, while the temple was still standing. So one of our hypotheses for a long time had been, well, the synagogues are something entirely different from temple worship. In the temple, we go there to pray, we go there to offer our sacrifices, we make pilgrimage there, we sing our hymns there, the Psalms and other things. Synagogues are more like, um, civic centers or something like that for the town.
Okay.
Well, now we have we have this stone decorated, pointing everyone who looks at it toward Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
And so I'm not at all comfortable separating out what happens in synagogues so cleanly from what happens in temples. I don't think sacrifices were made in synagogues. But remember, you and I can talk about our offering
Mhm.
as a sacrifice, and we can talk about our prayers as sacrifice and singing hymns to God as sacrifice.
Mhm.
And so I think the ancients could do this as well. In fact, we have texts talking about our prayers as our sacrifices. I forgot how I got on the topic. Oh, that stone. So that was just a spectacular find, a unique find that everyone keeps hoping we're going to see another example of. And so, of course, when the second temple synagogue was found there, everybody said, "Well, was there another stone?" Well, there was not in that synagogue.
Well, let me ask this about Magdala. As we have mentioned, archaeology does impact our faith in a very significant and positive way. In Magdala, what difference will it make to our faith if Magdala is the place where Mary Magdalene was born and lived, or if Magdalene refers to her as a tower of faith or
Hmm. I think, again, it connects us to our forebears in the faith.
Mhm.
Uh, the discovery of Magdala helps us think about a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus in the first century, someone on whom, the rest of us all encounter the risen Lord in very different ways than our forebears in the faith did, or those who knew the earthly Jesus during his ministry. Uh, it reminds us that our faith is the descendant of those who knew Jesus and followed him and thought it was worth leaving nearly everything behind
Mhm.
to become his disciple.
Mhm.
I have not left everything behind
Mhm.
to become his disciple. I've kept just a whole lot. I've not had to make that sacrifice. I know there are people, I know that I have brothers and sisters in the faith around the globe who have done something similar. But it reminds me how small my sacrifices as a follower of Christ have been in some ways.
Mhm.
And it becomes an encouragement to me. Look what Mary did. Look what the other disciples did. She was at the tomb. you know, she spoke to our risen Lord.
Mhm.
She did not flee when the other disciples fled. Now this is entirely conjectural, but in my mind, that's enough reason alone to give her this venerated title, the Tower of Faith or something like that, if that's what happened.
Mhm.
Now, so I won't shun that explanation. I think we just have to say right now we don't know, but there's no reason that our forebears in the faith would not have venerated her because of her faith.
Hmm. So, if a pastor or a Bible teacher or Sunday school leader wanted to tie some of this current news with biblical archaeology and just a lesson maybe that they were working on, how would you help them and make all of this work if they don't have the expertise that you do and the researchability and the access?
Well, of course, what they have is scripture, right?
Yeah.
And they have the Holy Spirit, and of course, they have a reading community to
Mhm.
help them read those texts together. I think with the discovery of Magdala, uh, there's enough out there in popular media that they can get their hands on,
Okay.
that they could read up about the excavation of the site and what was found there, and that can give them a real window into the lives of Jesus's followers. So
Mhm.
I'll just point out a couple of things to you. So, what makes it possible for a band of 12 men, but not just 12 men, a much larger band of disciples that include women, to spend so much time removed from the economy,
Mhm.
the economic system of the ancient world, which is agrarian, which is very demanding?
Mhm.
Uh, if you're living in a village, you probably are an expert in two or three different things. If you're the village potter, you're also probably tending sheep, or you're growing certain crops. You're doing more than one thing.
So they even had side hustles back then. I love it.
Oh yeah, that's
Everybody has
right.
a side hustle today, right?
They had to, in order, for the village to survive, right? And that type of lifestyle is very demanding on the body,
Mhm.
right? That kind of, for both men and women, it builds muscles. So I think you and I would be surprised at how strong our forebears were physically, both men and women. But also it wears down skeletons and ligaments and cartilage, uh, things like that. So we would see the wear and tear
Mhm.
on our brothers and sisters' bodies, were we able to go back in time. And the fact that Jesus and his disciples, whichever group we're talking about, extracts themselves from that entire system
Mhm.
means that they have to be supported somehow. And by the way, somebody has to step in and fill in for their absence. When James and John, Peter and Andrew leave their fishing industry behind, you remember James and John leave their father in the boat. We
Mhm.
ask, what impact does it have on the village, on the extended family? Uh, that reminds us that our gospels, I said it before, I'll say it again, probably more than one time, are windows into real lives.
Mhm.
Uh, and people who are hearing a preacher say, "Follow me," and willing to do it.
Mhm.
Right? That is a window into faith that is very powerful to me, given what I can not only learn about archaeology by being there, so that makes me a specialist, but what I could learn, I think, also by reading what's out there for popular consumption.
Mhm. Well, I am intrigued, and I'm going to put links to the show in our show notes. I'll put links to these articles and to your site of how to get involved with some of the work that you're doing in Israel
Wonderful.
and any of the other basic information so our listeners and viewers can connect to all of those. So, Dr. Strange, thank you for joining us and sharing a little bit about this.
You're quite welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And may I say, I'm ready to get a little dirt under my fingernails.
I hope you come.
We'll have to do a follow up or on location. How about that?
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, what a great idea.